Thanks. All right, so if we, so I go on to the next slide there. I'd like to start with a set of questions. How do we teach music encoding? Do we profess it? Do we profess to teach it? Or do we teach courses like encoding and computer-assisted analysis so that we might profess our scholarly understanding of digital musicology and the intersection of musicology and computing? However seemingly simple the question, what do we do, may be, we do a disservice to our field and to ourselves if we fail to consider the importance of pedagogy when it comes to answering such questions, no matter how commonsensical they may at first appear. This is actually a modified quote from Brett Hirsch, in which I have replaced his references to digital humanities with references to music. However, it is important, it is quite helpful set of questions to consider as we weigh the proper use of music encoding within the classroom. As Hirsch notes, some discussions of pedagogy seem pedestrian and, as he says, commonsensical. Nevertheless, they are foundational for establishing a pedagogy for music encoding. Indeed, just as current music encoding tools and methodologies had to start from scratch, so also the associated pedagogical strategies for incorporating these digital research methods must start at the most fundamental levels. And yet, the fundamental nature of these questions belies their complexity. It would be quite bold for any one person to claim to sufficiently answer these questions. After all, as Sean Michael Morris states, pedagogy has at its core timelines, mindfulness, and improvisation. Pedagogy concerns itself with the instantaneous, momentary, vital exchange that takes place in order for learning to happen. Like in improvisation, the pedagogue is constantly adapting to the audience, to the subject, and to the goals of the performance. Although this might appeal to some, we cannot treat the classroom like a formula that if a teacher follows, all students will then learn. And yet, it is tempting to approach pedagogical practices in this way. Perhaps this is just my background as a carpenter's son, but one tool will not allow you to build a house. Indeed, I spent many summers as a gopher for my father, crawling in his van to find that one tool among the hundreds that would get a specific job done. If we could go to the next slide there, Anna. So too must we as pedagogues build and rely upon a set of tools that will facilitate learning depending on a particular situation. The purpose of my presentation today is therefore not to answer the questions outlined at the start, but rather to provide some initial points of consideration as we, the music encoding community, build a collection of strategies for incorporating music encoding and other digital methods into music classrooms. With such a broad topic, teaching music encoding, I think it is helpful to consider digital pedagogy more broadly and how music encoding might fit within that context. What do we mean by digital pedagogy? Like its parent, digital humanities, the term has been widely discussed across the humanities with little resolution. Let's break the term into its constituent parts. Do you have the next slide there, Anna? Sorry. Thanks. Let's break the term into its constituent parts. Morris describes pedagogy as a scholarship unto itself, a study of learning and the many ways it is fueled in classrooms, in workshops, in studios, in writing centers, wherever learning is poised to occur. While Brian Kroxall and Adeline Coe have likened the digital to that which consists of electrical elements, I think music scholars require a much more precise definition, particularly considering our history with analog electronic devices such as oscilloscopes analog synthesizers, and microphones, just to name a few. So I turn to the definition from the OED, which states that digital refers to signals, information, or data represented by a series of discrete values, commonly the numbers 0 and 1, typically for electronic storage or processing. I would then define digital pedagogy as the study of the processes by which learning occurs either in or as a result of the electronic storage or processing of discrete values. This is an admittedly wide umbrella that may leave many uneasy about the sorts of learning and activities it could include. In many ways, such a broad definition harkens to the unease many digital humanists feel when someone asserts that doing digital research involves simply reading an article online or publishing in an e-journal. Indeed, at the popularization of learning management systems such as Blackboard and Moodle, many were happily convinced that digital pedagogy simply meant offering a course online. As Morris quips, digital pedagogy was easy, a mere work of relocation. In one sense, this view is correct. Relocated and digitized content has been used to teach the subject at hand. However, limiting digital pedagogy to posting slides or lecture recordings online hamstrings the types of resources and capacities that the digital affords. Within digital humanities pedagogy, there has been a trend away from the types of sterile and static practices that simply transfer existing analog content and methods online and towards more active and student-centered approaches that emphasize collaboration, hacking, process, and construction, and that actively bring cutting-edge research into the heart of the classroom. In this regard, Morris's definition of pedagogy is particularly helpful, for within true digital pedagogy, we find continuous acts of refinement, learning from the digital approaches that have or have not worked in the past in an effort to improve and enhance the learning experience. Pedagogy has long been at the heart of humanities computing. Early examples would include workshops such as the Teaching Computers and the Humanities series, sponsored by the Association for Computers and the Humanities, and as well as the Computers and Teaching in the Humanities Conference. Moreover, the 1980s and 90s saw the establishment of dedicated digital humanities centers, such as the Center for Computing in the Humanities at the University of Toronto, the Center for Computing in the Humanities, now the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities at the University of Virginia, and the Humanities Advanced Technology and Information Institute at the University of Glasgow, now the Department of Information Studies. But despite the efforts of these centers and the establishment of initiatives such as the Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria, pedagogy was sidelined in public discourses through much of the first decade of the 2000s. Whether this occurred as a result of funding availability or other external pressures, research methods garnered the collective attentions of both scholars and benefactors. As Hirsch recalls, Donald Bruce's plenary presentation at the 2009 Digital Humanities Summer Institute highlighted this growing imbalance in the scholarly literature, something Hirsch labels bracketing, and the community began to take note. By the end of 2011, the Digital Humanities at Oxford Summer School had been started, the first DAT Camp Pedagogy had been held, and 2 roundtable discussions that focused on digital pedagogy had been accepted for the 2012 annual meeting of the Modern Languages Association in Seattle. Since 2011, pedagogy has once again become a publicly discussed concern of the digital humanities community. In that period, the National Endowment for the Humanities has approved 63 different grants totaling over $8 million that develop digital teaching resources and pedagogical methodologies. And the Mellon Foundation has added over $3.8 million across 7 different grants that are similarly focused. The literature on digital pedagogies has also grown significantly since 2011. The volumes of the debates in the Digital Humanities series and the Hacking the Academy have devoted numerous chapters to the topic in journals such as Digital Humanities Quarterly and Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, as well as blogging platforms such as Hybrid Pedagogy have developed and devoted significant space to digital pedagogy. Music has also had a sustained history in pedagogical practice and research, and it has a similarly long history with technology. I'll not rehearse what are well-known stories such as Johann Sebastian Bach's widely varied education in music performance and composition, or Thomas Edison's invention of the cylinder phonograph. However, it is interesting that music pedagogy and technology became somewhat estranged in the 20th century. Reporting on the state of higher education institutes in the United Kingdom in 2007, Carola Bohm traced the history of music technology through 5 generations of researchers and innovators. The first generation, labeled the experimenters and innovators, includes Schaefer, Stockhausen, Eimert, and Cage, among others. Then came the commercializers in the 1970s and 1980s, such as Boulez, Vercoe, Wishart, Puckett, and others who began to teach music technologies in the classroom and who began to market technologies widely. This gave rise to the third generation, the first lecturers in the 1990s and 2000s, who, seeing the rise in affordable digital audio equipment, wanted to provide specialized university quality training. Bohm's fourth generation was therefore one in formation when she wrote in 2007, as it included those who were then graduating from newly constructed degree programs in music technology. Finally, the fifth generation was one she projected would move on to graduate level education in the 20-teens. Despite this optimism, she still concluded in 2007 that music technology remained the discipline that never was. Bohm has since published a reappraisal of music technology within the UK, conceiving of a sixth generation in which music technology has been cemented as an academic field, and in which the fourth and fifth generations have begun to have an impact on the industry. Wanting to compare her findings with current pedagogical practices in the United States, I conducted a survey of more than 60 of the country's leading music schools, which you should find on the slide in front of you. After exploring the course catalogs of each of these institutions, by the way, some of these really need to think about upgrading their systems, I found that all of the institutions offer technology-related courses to their students. Although I have only looked closely at schools in the UK and the US, I dare say that one would find similar results in other countries around the world. One could conclude, therefore, that digital pedagogy is well in hand throughout music schools today. We'll move on. In a world in which coronavirus did not exist and we were all together in a lecture theater in Boston right now, I would expect that some, or even most of you, would either be preparing to launch some rotten tomatoes in my direction, or packing up your things so that you could head out to see what teas, coffees, and snacks were available to you in the lobby. And perhaps some of you are considering the latter option from the comfort of your own homes. But before you move, before you leave us, I ask you to stick with me and give me just a few more minutes chance here. Let's instead turn back to the course descriptions of the same groups of US institutions I offered initially there. Given the emergence of quote-unquote maker culture, it is unsurprising that many institutions are now offering courses on digital music recording, music synthesis technologies, sound production, music distribution and marketing, and multimedia integration and alignment, including audio and film, video, and video games. We might even add music notation software to that mix, particularly given the divergent idiosyncrasies of Woodley Pond, Finale, Sibelius, MuseScore, Dorico, etc. And by the way, if you aren't aware of him and are looking for a good laugh, take a look at the reviews of these software packages on YouTube made by Martin Keary, also known as Tantacruel. When I removed these courses from the list. In other words, looking for course descriptions in which digital humanities-related research methods are mentioned, such as optical music recognition, notation encoding, GIS, score and media alignment, metadata generation and curation, network analysis, computer-aided distant reading of corpora. That list is whittled down to just 20 courses. And that generously includes the courses on notation that purport to include the latest developments in digital music notation that may or may not include music encoding. If we remove those from the list, that number is cut in half. That is, across more than 60 of the most reputed music institutions of higher education in the United States, only 10 course descriptions could be found that use these methods. I admit the inherent bias in that statement. Course descriptions are rarely updated and cannot be expected to include all that a particular course might offer. However, it is symptomatic of the state of today's music academy, and particularly in the core areas of music history, literature, and theory. As another example, consider the annual meetings of the American Musicological Society and the Royal Music Association. I have examined the published abstracts for the AMS dating back to 2010 and the RMA dating back to 2016, as earlier ones are not available on their website. As you can see from this graph, the AMS has twice featured 8 papers, posters, or roundtables that include digital methods in their abstracts in 2012 and 2019. These 2 years were significant outliers, as the remainder have featured between 0 and 4 presentations. Even if we accept that some may have been left out because of their abstracts not mentioning any digital methods, the overall percentage remains paltry when we consider how large the conference is. For instance, 2019 featured more than 380 different presentations, which leaves roughly only 2%, including digital methods. The Royal Music Association is not any better, as 2017 and 2019 were the high watermarks, featuring only 2 presentations that mentioned digital methods. This all points to an absence of digital methods from research workflows of historical musicologists, or at least the workflows of those considered within the mainstream of the discipline. Indeed, if faculty are not engaging with these methods in their own research, they are not likely to teach them to their students. On the contrary, emerging areas such as music and recording, sound production, and electroacoustics, those fields commonly included under the umbrella of music technology, have largely adopted digital methods in their research and pedagogical workflows. Even applied musical instruction has begun to incorporate more digital resources, as more and more apps are being built to provide access to sheet music, to record practice or performance, and for immediate analysis of those performances. Sadly, music theory, music literature, and music history have not been so quick to adopt digital methods in either research or teaching. Indeed, based on my findings regarding course offerings and research paper presentations, musicologists and music theory scholars seems to relegate digital methods to research on 20th and 21st century music, in essence, where digital media already exists. They are much less likely to employ digital methods for music composed before 1900. This is not to say that musicologists and theorists are unaware of the developments in these other areas, nor are they completely ignorant of the goings-on in the digital humanities. Surveys of the field would indicate that a lack of freely available digital data is one of the largest barriers to widespread implementation of digital research methods. However, it is also true that specialists in music before the 20th century are often unaware of the latest technologies, or at least unaware of how their research could benefit from those methodologies. Additionally, a large number are generally uneasy about computers. After all, they argue, learning how to use Finale and Sibelius was traumatic enough. Regardless of the reasons, students continue to pass through theory, literature, and history curricula thinking that the cutting edge in these fields remains closely tied to analog outputs or digital recordings. Looking at it another way, and a more superficial way, I admit, Compare the toys of musicologists and theorists with the toys of other music scholars. The former has books, journals, ebooks, recordings, and PDFs, along with instruments of varying types. The latter has all of the toys of the former, but then gets to add mixers, synthesizers, loudspeakers, microphones, streaming services, and computer algorithms. If the technologies that the fields employ are dated, we should not be surprised when students feel a growing disconnect with the fields. So what are we to do? Over the years, this community has frequently engaged in discussions, both internally and externally, with other like-minded groups, strategizing methods of promoting music encoding and the various capacities it affords. Any attempt to list these efforts would be incomplete and do a disservice to those not mentioned. However, engaging with these scholarly communities at their annual meetings has had positive effects. In addition, pedagogical efforts such as the digital methods workshops hosted at various conferences and intensive summer schools around the world have provided hands-on opportunities for researchers to learn and interact with music encoding practices. These corporate efforts add to the numerous individual conversations that we all have had with those in our own institutions. Of course, these should all continue, but I would argue that an increased emphasis on incorporating these into undergraduate and graduate level instruction is a critical next step in transforming the discipline. Following Bohm's outline, one could argue that we may only be in our second or third generation of music encoding. So now is the time to start incorporating encoding into the classroom. In formulating a strategy for incorporating digital research methods such as music encoding into course curricula, we would do well to learn from my digital humanities colleagues. As mentioned earlier, pedagogy was not a significant focus of the digital humanities in the 2000s. And when that began to change in the early 2010s, DH pedagogical practices were widely varied. On the one hand, researchers were simply teaching students based on their own research and methodologies, which we know vary from project to project and person to person. On the other hand, it undoubtedly confused many students who were trying to figure out what this digital humanities thing was, incidentally something that practitioners themselves still have difficulty defining. However, the field has begun to coalesce, leading Deborah Garwood and Alex Poole to conclude that DH pedagogy inspires students and faculty members to critically, openly, collaboratively, collectively, and symbiotically explore existing or to carve out new research and scholarly areas across disciplines. The same could be said for digital pedagogy in music-related studies. It should inspire students and faculty to critically, openly, collaboratively, and collectively explore existing scholarship and to establish new areas of inquiry that are not necessarily limited by disciplinary boundaries. There are a number of techniques that one could employ in tackling the issue of digital pedagogy. Some, like Claire Battershill and Shauna Ross in their recent monograph, Using Digital Humanities in the Classroom, discuss the barriers that have been constructed against the incorporation of digital methods in the classroom. They categorize them according to the source, that is, as coming from the instructor, the students, or fellow colleagues. Within the context of a monograph acting as a practical guide to incorporating well-established pedagogical methods into classroom environments, such an organization makes sense. However, we are not so fortunate in having tried and tested pedagogical methods for incorporating digital methods into music classrooms, and particularly music history and theory classrooms. Therefore, the remainder of my discussion is going to be more topical, exploring the issues of audience, and then managing stress and chaos before concluding with a couple of skills that should be included in digital curricula. Customers, and even students. While one might argue that this has its drawbacks, indeed, I once worked at a music store where my colleagues and I would frequently joke that the world would be a better place without customers. Considering one's audience does help to provide perspective for what we do and how we do it. Indeed, student-centered pedagogical strategies have become quite popular in the past couple of decades, so that is where I want to begin. In particular, I think one challenge to digital pedagogy appears when the instructor gets so excited about a newly discovered or developed tool, digital method, or digital theory. In their enthusiasm, the instructor forgets why the students are sitting there in that lecture theater in the first place. And the class then becomes a lesson in a particular digital tool rather than the original subject. Regardless of whether said instructor is excited about a tool, a digital method, or some minutia of digital humanities theory, Ryan Cordell boldly asserts, undergraduate students do not care about digital humanities. And he adds, most graduate students do not come to graduate school primarily invested in becoming digital humanists. His comments are also relevant to music students. Many have intentionally avoided computer science and mathematics. And we could even take this one step further. There was a pervasive theory in pedagogical writing around the turn of the century that students were, quote unquote, digital natives, and were therefore more comfortable with and competent in all activities related to computers. However, as Brandon Locke comments, students are often much less adept at creating content that is not tightly mediated by some kind of commercial service with restrictions on forms, such as Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Students are therefore just as reticent as other generations when it comes to angle brackets and curly braces. Indeed, despite the digital natives moniker that sadly still surfaces in pedagogical literature today, it's important to remember that many music students will not have the inbuilt, innate, or otherwise pre-existing familiarity with or comfort with music encoding or code-based analysis tools, nor do they necessarily want to spend significant time learning how to code or encode. When developing course content that utilizes digital methods, one should therefore consider students' skill levels at entry and the desired results once they complete the course. As an illustration, I point to a course that I teach at Glasgow called Music Curation and Analytics, which is offered to upper-level undergraduates in information studies. Most of these students are not music students, and one would assume intentionally so, since they are studying music information studies rather than music. The first year I taught the course, I had them transcribe a piece of music in MuseScore and then export it to Music XML and onto MEI before they then edited that MEI file. The idea was that they would gain experience in understanding each format. Since the students already had a level of XML training, I figured that they would be able to handle the MEI modification without any trouble. For students who had a background in music, this task was not too onerous, but others really struggled with the transcription into MuseScore, despite me providing a basic introduction to reading Western music notation, because they remained too unfamiliar with music terminology and therefore spent much of the semester trying to transcribe their piece, let alone considering what changes could be made to the MEI. In the second year, I focused less on the specifics of music notation and more on the comparisons between Music XML and MEI, describing the differences and what those meant both semantically and in terms of the capacities of both formats. Students did much better with this approach given their existent background in XML. Indeed, this latter approach was much more attuned to the course objectives, which were to introduce students to the ways in which music-related information is created, stored, analyzed, and otherwise reused. Despite this anecdote, some outside this community, and some perhaps within it, might argue that music encoding is too new and its accompanying toolset too underdeveloped to be presented in the classroom. Those promoting this view might worry that students could be overwhelmed and frustrated by complicated software installations and tools that frequently break or do not perform as expected. On the one hand, this risk can be reduced by limiting student expectations of the technology. For instance, MEI rolled out version 4.0 while I was in the middle of teaching music encoding to a group of master students at Glasgow. As you might be aware, version 4.0 involved significant changes to the way in which the metadata was captured in the MEI head element. However, at the beginning of the course, in fact, several weeks in advance of the version release, I had mentioned that MEI is a community-based standard for encoding music's notation, and that those standards can change to adapt to meet the needs of the community. The students were therefore much more flexible in their expectations of the technology. Rather than causing significant upheaval in the middle of the class, the update in MEI versions offered us the opportunity to explore the new guidelines and to learn from them together. We were able to discuss the changes and to consider the semantic impacts of those changes. This is a relatively tame example, but there are others in which something may actually fail. Indeed, Catherine Harris goes so far as to insist that students will break digital tools. As Lisa Spiro notes, however, the digital humanities community recognizes the value of failure in the pursuit of innovation, since it indicates that the experiment was likely high risk and means that we collectively learned from failure rather than reproducing it, assuming, of course, the failure is documented. Indeed, students should not be completely shielded from unsuccessful results. Rather, they should be trained in ways to document them and to learn from them. Beyond turning these challenges and even failures into positive learning experiences, the music encoding community can recommend systemic controls that effectively would limit students' potential exposure to frustrating results until they have reached a level of training at which they can either troubleshoot them or can properly contextualize their experience. Such controls, I would argue, should come in the form of a coordinated progressive strategy for introducing digital methods into music history, literature, and theory curricula. Of course, tiered approaches to curricula are nothing new to music pedagogues, who teach a broad range of courses from music appreciation to advanced Schenkerian analysis. However, the same pedagogues may not have considered that a similar approach is required for digital methods. Given the general reticence that many music students have towards computers, I would suggest that we need to start by doing some public relations work before throwing students into the world of angle brackets and curly braces. That is, show them the utility and capabilities that the digital methods afford. This is the step that many instructors missed in the early days of the digital humanities. Instructors rushed to create survey courses in DH, forgetting that they first needed to show students why DH was important and how it could positively benefit their studies and research. As Cordell notes, students and colleagues were much more receptive to digital methods when they were integrated into a course that they already deemed relevant to their field. Indeed, this is what Adeline Coe describes as she encourages instructors to employ the tools with which students are most familiar, such as Google Maps, Wikipedia, and others, before delving into more complicated elements. I would therefore suggest that simple tools and practices could be integrated into music survey curricula to provide data-intensive illustrations over the overarching concepts that are being taught. At this level, it is critical that the expertise and training for digital resources should be minimal, so that it does not overshadow the subject-specific training that is going on. Jonathan Howell provides a good illustration of this balance. He describes how he created a linguistics course that relied heavily on the programming language R, but that his students struggled to keep up with both the programming requirements of the course as well as the linguistics content. Before offering the course a second time, he built a web application that allowed his students to take advantage of the analytical tools offered by R without requiring them to know how to code in R. The result was a much better student experience that highlighted the benefits of digital approaches within the context of linguistic research. For us, resources such as the Verovio online editor and JSON Bollock could be incorporated in the same way because they do not require significant coding expertise at the outset. However, we could use more of these types of low-level digital tools that allow students to start familiarizing themselves with digital methods. There are, of course, limitations to digital tools, as Locke argues. Tool-based literacy limits sustainability, cross-platform work, and understanding of the impact of media upon the message. It is therefore important for curricula to build on these initial introductions, both with surveys of digital methods and with more focused digital training. Although it is not a degree-based curriculum, I would argue that the offerings of the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, DHSI, are a helpful exemplar. Begun in 2000, DHSI offers intensive training in the digital humanities. It offers over 50 different one-week courses over a 2-week period in June that cover a broad range of topics relating to DH research and pedagogical practice. A sample of these courses is provided on screen. Much like other digital humanities summer schools, DHSI operates on the assumption that students have already encountered digital methods within their coursework, research, or teaching. This digital first contact has the DHSI student itching to learn more, but that person may not have any level of technical expertise. DHSI therefore offers a number of foundations courses that provide entry-level surveys of digital methods and training in courses such as TEI, DH technologies, introductory computation, digitization, and indeed even music encoding, which is taught by Raphael Viglianti and myself. I would argue that these types of courses are the logical second step in a tiered digital curricula. For degree-based music instruction, this could include introductions to music encoding, such as that at DHSI, in which students actually start encoding music using various standards, or it could include basic introductions to computational analysis. The key is that these courses should build knowledge from the ground up. That is, they should start with the assumption that students have little or no expertise in that particular area. The third and final tier in this approach involves offering more advanced courses in digital methods that require a certain level of expertise at the outset. These courses may explore the areas of computer learning, analytical methods in Python or R, or even combinations of digital methods. And often these courses are much more focused in terms of their musical remit. For instance, one could envision a graduate level course on digital stylistic analyses of Stravinsky's oeuvre. Having outlined this tiered approach, it is important to consider what topics are fundamental to the discipline as it moves towards digital research methodologies, and which are less crucial. Given the widely varied and changing state of digital methodologies in music, I would not pretend to offer such a list of priorities on my own here. That said, I would suggest 2 important skill sets that should be included. The first is digital literacy. Despite the increased use of digital pedagogies, Locke comments, there should be reason for concern that students are often taking part in digital information and media transmission, but are not currently trained in the literacies and affordances of the technology they use. Indeed, it is almost cliche that every university course today claims to instill in students critical thinking skills, but this can be very difficult to achieve in a single course. I would argue that if we continue to make claims in this regard, we should rethink the history and theory curricula if we are to engage in critical thinking on the level that approaches what Locke and others would label digital literacy. Although students are accustomed to personal reflection in the forms of surveys and to providing reviews of their meals and shopping experiences, it can be difficult for them to think outside of their own experience, and particularly about the strengths and weaknesses of those digital methods and the resulting limitations of the data that those methods produce. I would argue that there are 4 components to digital critical evaluation. To illustrate the first 2, permit me a brief excursus. Nestled in the hills of western Pennsylvania is a small city called Beaver Falls. Known as the hometown of American Football Hall of Famer Joe Namath and the setting of the 1980s TV show Alf, Beaver Falls is also home to a small liberal arts school called Geneva College. As an alumnus of Geneva, I could regale you with some of its claims to fame, which include participating in the Underground Railroad during the American Civil War, as well as claiming to have played the first men's college basketball game in 1893. However, my reason for mentioning Geneva in this context is not for one of these claims to fame, but rather in connection with what some might consider to be a mundane architectural feature, a bridge at the edge of campus that crosses some 50 feet or 15.25 meters roughly above the Beaver River, connecting Beaver Falls to a small township called Eastvale, which you can see here from the Eastvale side of the river. This was the site of an interesting experiment that did not result in a discipline-changing discovery, but rather an experiment that epitomizes the learning experience. A personal friend and Geneva alumnus told me of one of his experiences as a student there. During one of his summer vacations, he had the opportunity to work as a lab assistant for one of the chemistry professors. This meant that he and another student were tasked with preparing the labs for the autumn term, which included cleaning the labs and their equipment, taking inventory and disposing of, ordering and receiving new equipment and supplies. One day, he and this other student came across a substantial container of sodium that needed to be disposed of. This was back in the 1960s, and what else were two college students to do with a bucket of sodium? Of course, let's take it down to the Eastvale Bridge and heave it over the side to see what happens. According to my friend, the result was quite spectacular, resulting in a jet of water that shot up onto the bridge and to the vehicles trying to cross it. Looking back on the situation, said alumnus admitted that it was probably not the safest or smartest thing to do. However, it illustrates two examples that I think are critical to education: knowledge and play. You see, the two students knew of sodium's reactivity with water, and they were willing, admittedly unadvisedly, to apply that knowledge to see what happens. And given the fact that my friend told the story with a smirk on his face some 40 years later, would indicate that he has never forgotten about the violent reaction that can occur when sodium comes into contact with water. I would therefore argue, first and foremost, that students need to have the requisite subject knowledge to be able to contextualize information. Then they should be afforded the opportunity to apply that knowledge while playing with specific digital tools. This approach to digital pedagogy is well established across the sciences and humanities, as is chronicled by Gentry Sayers. However, Nuria Garcia et al. Caution us that digital sandboxes we establish in classrooms need to have boundaries. They argue the goal in the college classroom should not be to allow for open-ended digital play and exploration of the kind that professional humanities scholars are motivated to undertake. Because as one learner noted, the amount of information can truly be overwhelming, and a large part of the success of this exercise seems to lie in not only how to use the digital tools to the best advantage, but in avoiding dead ends. Even if students are afforded the space to tinker with digital tools, they often lack the ability to understand the raw data that results. As Jonathan Howell argues, quantitative literacy ought not to be regarded by the instructor in a non-STEM field as an add-on to existing course content, but ideally as an integral part of teaching students how to be a historian, anthropologist, classicist, etc., and I would add music scholar. The past 3 to 4 months have provided an illustrative and instructive example of the dangers of quantitative illiteracy if we are willing to look. The COVID-19 outbreak has provided an unparalleled, and by the way, I refuse to use the word unprecedented given its overuse and abuse lately, an unparalleled deluge of quantitative data for public consumption. We have had daily updates of test rates, positive test results, negative test results, hospital admission statistics, ICU admission statistics, death rates of COVID listed as a potential cause, deaths of people who tested positive with COVID, home care deaths, and now so-called R numbers. Despite all this raw data, it has been painfully obvious that many, including the media and our politicians, are ill-equipped to parse the numbers and to understand what they mean and what they do not mean. Similarly, as quantitative analysis becomes increasingly present in musical analysis, it is important for the field to consider how it can teach students how to value these analytical techniques and the data they generate, evaluating the assumptions inherent in the methods and tools, and thereby critically evaluating the conclusions that result. Moreover, focusing solely on digital and quantitative methods provides students with a limited scope and therefore hampers their ability to critically evaluate those methods. As suggested by Paul Fife, it is actually in the combination of analog and digital methods that students gain the requisite space for critical observation. In a class on Pride and Prejudice, Fife comments, unplugging the search engine can help students perceive the limitations as well as the possibilities of what makes these search engines run, that is, pattern matching, which by itself is a far cry from reading at any distance. It sharpens students' attention to forms of analysis that explore the analog and digital domains along a continuum. It helps students to interrogate these various kinds of readings they can do therein, and it reveals all of those kinds of readings as actively constituting critical interpretations. Critical evaluation of digital tools, resources, and methods, even such as music encoding, require students first to have discipline-specific knowledge of music. They should then be trained in how to encode that music before they are given the space to play around with various approaches to encoding music. Whether or not quantitative methods have been used, the students need training to illuminate the strengths and weaknesses of the encoding techniques they have employed. And then finally, they need the space to be able to compare these digital methods with analog versions of the same. In addition to digital literacy, digital pedagogies in music should include skills in collaboration. This may be an area of discomfort for many music theory scholars and musicologists who, as noted by Chris Schaefer, prefer working in isolation. However, one of the hallmarks of the digital humanities has been the promotion of collaborative research. Digital humanists freely recognize that no one person possesses the requisite skills and knowledge to produce a high-quality digital resource. Students should therefore be confronted with this reality. That is, they may not be able to master all things musical while also trying to master all things digital. And they should be therefore encouraged to specialize and collaborate with those with complementary specialties. Even so, as Rebecca Frost Davis asked, but how do you teach collaboration? This question has been particularly problematic in DH pedagogy, particularly in terms of assigning credit in assessments. Regarding the potential inequality of assigning all group participants the same grade, regardless of their contribution level, some have innovated systems of assessing each person according to their contribution to the group's final output. But even this approach has its challenges. While I do not pretend to have solved the issue, I have found one method that works for my music curation and analytics students, while avoiding some of the common pitfalls. From the beginning, I was confronted with the reality that most of my students do not know how to read music notation, and that I did not have the time to provide significant training in this while also covering aspects of encoding and curating notation data. Two other facts were also clear to me as I was planning this course. First, students rarely invest the amount of time outside of class that the university recommends they do. For the humanities, that's 9 hours of prep time for every hour spent in class. Second, students are often frustrated by graded group projects because of the inequalities that surface. My solution was to have a scheduled session at the beginning of each week during which students have structured time to prepare for the week's lecture. During that period, they are given a brief introduction to the week's topic, and then they are asked to play together in groups at trying to accomplish some set tasks that are unassessed. The following day, we discuss their group work during the lecture, which is then followed by a lab period in which they are individually assigned an assessed task that builds on each week's group activity and lecture. During the group session in the first week, I tell the students that they can form their own groups, but I make sure that each group has at least one person who can read music. For the tasks relating to music notation, such as using MuseScore to transcribe a piece of music or encoding a piece to MEI, the person who can read music is asked to assist those who cannot. Given that the group sessions of the course are unassessed, some students stop attending towards the end of the semester, of course. But most continue to attend, and by the end are working well together, not only on the group activities, but also helping each other on their individual assignments. In fact, several of the students have remarked that this approach to group activities has helped them to better understand both lecture content and to be better prepared for the assessments. To conclude, imagine a situation in which a music theory instructor is teaching about chord progressions and asserts that an authentic cadence is the most common and most authoritative way to end a piece of tonal music. Immediately, a student shouts from the back of the room, "Prove it!" I dare say the vast majority of instructors today would not be able to prove it, even though they might be able to point to some important examples. While complete proof might be outside our grasp, particularly considering how little music throughout history has been preserved, it is well within the realm of possibility that said instructor could run a quick script on a large corpus of music and show said student that an authentic cadence is indeed most prevalent. At the same time, however, said instructor could simultaneously discover that a 6/1 cadence is also common on a certain group of pieces, which could then provide an avenue of investigation for both the instructor and the class. However fantastical this story may seem, situations like this arise on a regular basis within the digital humanities classrooms, even if on a smaller scale. With training and a strategic approach to digital methods implementation, the same could be true for music classrooms. Some historical musicologists and music scholars might recoil at what has been presented here as too statistical, or at least too unsettling and computer dependent. After all, much of what I have advocated here requires a reconsideration of the ways in which we approach music history, literature, and theory instruction, even on the most fundamental levels. And yet, the music encoding community offers a supportive atmosphere for those who want to incorporate encoding into their research workflows. As this community continues to grow, and as music encoding continues to become more prevalent in research methodologies, we must consider the future, and particularly how these methodologies can be passed to the next generation of researchers. So, while communities such as ours may not be able to realize a change in music history or music theory curricula by ourselves, we can encourage those respective communities to update and expand their methodologies. Indeed, we can continue to promote the latest innovations in digital methodologies at national meetings and focused workshops, and thereby continue to highlight the benefits of employing digital methods within those respected fields. We can also start developing hierarchies of digital pedagogies as guides to both professional societies and individual departments for incorporating digital methodologies into their curricula. Finally, as you quote unquote go out to your institutions, I am of course speaking in the digital sense here, consider how you could either start incorporating music encoding and digital methods into your classes, or alternatively, how you might encourage your colleagues to do so. Indeed, by promoting best practices in both research and teaching as a collective, we can, like Bohm, look ahead to our own 4th, 5th, and 6th generations of music encoders and the exciting innovations that will accompany them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was really inspirational and reminded me of why we had been so excited about putting together a pedagogy workshop for the Tuesday sessions, and that just turned out to be unwieldy under the current circumstances, but really important to take these things up. If you're following the chat, you'll see that Stefan has indicated that he and I will be monitoring the chat for questions. So if there's something you'd like to ask, please pose it there. It's just with a group this large, it's easier to see it in the chat than it is to see the digital hand raise. I have a couple of questions, Timothy, if you don't mind taking them from me to start with. I had a question of when you were doing your survey of course descriptions across universities in the United States, was it also Canada? Well, at any rate, North America, were those courses primarily undergraduate or graduate? Because I feel like that makes a difference in how we had this intervention as well.
Where I could, and this is this is some of the limitations of the systems that I was dealing with and mentioned in passing. Definitely under graduate courses, I did intentionally try to get at the graduate course levels as well. But even at the graduate course level, I was surprised that there was also not very much integration of digital tools within those curricula as well.
Yeah. I'd also be curious to know if you have any firsthand experience with, let's say, friendly persuasion when it comes to integrating this with colleagues teaching other courses. I think the tiered model absolutely makes sense. I'm thinking about the fact that right now I don't teach the first year introductory courses, so that's not my purview. So do you have tips for how to have those conversations with your colleagues?
Well, I think in the first instance, as I mentioned there, few people are willing to teach that which they don't themselves practice or don't themselves understand. And so I think the first conversations are to make sure that your colleagues are aware of the capacities that digital tools and methodologies afford. And I had a conversation with a colleague here just a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about various technologies, and he was completely unaware of some of these things that were out there and the capabilities that we now have. And he was actually very excited about it. And I was actually pleasantly surprised at his enthusiasm. So I think that's the first conversation that needs to happen. But after that, I think then you start to point to people where the bar of entry is really low, where someone doesn't have to know a whole lot about coding, but they know how to fill in a web form, for instance, and can output something that's useful and beneficial to the class.
Right. Okay. All right. So I'm seeing we have a question from Julia Flanders. She's thanks you for your talk, and also wants to know if you found ways of introducing students to music and coding that will foreground the structural insights about music rather than the technical and notational aspects, either through highlighting or hand annotation, something like that.
Right. Yeah. So my undergraduate course that I mentioned there, because it is students who are not focused on or expert in music, I've had to really think very carefully about this. What can I actually expect of the students? And at Glasgow, we have 11 weeks that we have in order to get the things accomplished, which is not a lot of time.
Right.
But one of the things that the most simple thing that I tried to capture with the students is to instill in them what is actually being captured. And it is the essence of sound, some sort of oftentimes structured sound that is spread throughout time, and trying to capture that in some way, and trying to show them the various ways in which that is done. And we even take a little bit of an ethnomusicological approach, and just to look visually at how different societies have dealt with this issue, and how, now that we're in the digital age, how we are continuing to use that to try to accomplish similar tasks. So yes, we do look at less onerous types of notation. For instance, in Scotland, solfa notation is quite common, especially in church hymnals, which most people here in Scotland will have come across at least at some point. And so we take a look at that and say, okay, what's going on here? What's actually being captured? And of course, in those instances, it's just a solfege. But it's something that even if people don't necessarily understand solfege, most people know the sound of music, so they can at least connect to that concept on a very basic level. And I hope that answers the question there.
Well, and that leads into a point that Richard just made about saying that our colleague Karen Desmond suggested that music notation is already a form of encoding. And maybe that's a way of easing colleagues into discussions about this, that they're already skilled in a particular type of encoding.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And I see that
that's
Emily,
a really good point.
Yeah, it is. And that's, Karen and Richard, thank you for that. Emily Ann Hopkins has a question. She says, you mentioned people being resistant because DH approaches are too statistical, unsettling, and computer dependent, which sounds like a lot of other aspects of modern life to her. How much of this music pedagogy catching up to other areas versus how much is music-specific challenges? In other words, nobody's talking about the digital sciences because tech has always been well integrated there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are two things at play, right? We do have musicians who are quite happy and quite comfortable to deal with technology in a very complex way. I mean, we look at the music technology side of things. That's precisely what a lot of those people are doing. Mm-hmm. If we look at more traditional musicology, music theory, music literature, even music performance, in a way, again, those people who are dealing with 20th century, 21st century are, again, much more open to the idea that they'll use a computer for something. But even then, even if we take a step back, I think it is important to acknowledge to our colleagues just how complicated the software packages of Finale and Sibelius are, mm-hmm. And that they have done, those colleagues have accomplished some very complex things just in doing something as simple as transcribing a piece to Finale, for instance. Yeah. And that in of itself should not be necessarily be ignored. I think it's something to say, okay, you've done this, and in fact, I think it's even safe to say that in a lot of ways, even though a lot of what we do as music scholars is qualitative analysis, there is a level of quantitative analysis that also occurs. We wouldn't have, for instance, systems hierarchies of chord progressions, for instance, unless there was at least some understanding of that is the way that music generally flows, right? And at least Western music flows, right? So I think we need to be unafraid to point to the areas at which quantitative analysis already occurs, and not necessarily argue that we therefore need to expand it, but to show that it already occurs and that we can actually continue to improve rather than subvert and replace the qualitative analysis that is already there.
Thank you. That's great advice. I think we have time for one more question before we take a 10-minute break. This comes from Joshua. With the learning of encoding and other DH through no-code tools and lowering the barrier of entry through higher level interfaces such as the R web app you mentioned, is there any danger here of students learning the tool like just another software package rather than learning the underlying approaches to music encoding?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why it is important that occurs as the first step, right? The sort of entry level. And at that level, it's sort of up to the instructor and the capability of the classroom, how far into depth you go into the limitations of that tool. I think if you don't do it at that initial level, you definitely go into that as you move into the second tier, right? Where you say, okay, you've already learned these things. And even if it's as simple as saying, you've already learned Sibelius, you've already learned Finale, for instance, mm-hmm. Here are some of the weaknesses of those software packages, and here are some others that you might consider and that might have some advantages over those other packages.
That was a quick answer. So I'm going to take one more question from Jim De La Hunt, who asked if you have suggestions for an app developer like he is, about which tools will have low barriers to entry and provide high musical insight so that he can make useful and not unnecessarily difficult tools.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm having to go back to my teaching of music theory and music history a few years back for this, but I think some examples might be ways. So for instance, in my music curation and analytics course, one of the things that I have done is to set up just a simple Python notebook, which is just a bunch of fields basically that my students are a little bit familiar with Python, so they're not as adverse to coding, but even so, I use that in order to teach them some basics of Music 21. And I think that might be a good place to start, to take a look at some of the analytical tools that are more code-based that are out there, that then you could build something on top of those, because those packages have communities that are focused on developing them and making them as robust as possible. So that takes some of that work outside of your responsibility. And if you can lay something over top of those packages, I think that's a really good place to start. But beyond that, yeah, I think one of the areas maybe that could use more focus, and this is me talking as someone who's interested in curation and metadata, but would be the metadata side, and encouraging students in better file management practices, and that's oftentimes a more dry subject. And at least broadly speaking, to undergraduates especially, that's I do have 3 weeks on metadata that can be fairly dry for them, although I try to spice it up as much as I can. But I think, ways in which we can encourage good practice that way would also be quite helpful.
Thank you. All right, I know there's another question from Cynthia, so maybe Timothy in the break, you all can have a discussion in the chat. I do want to give people time to take a 10-minute break before we start the slime session.